Welcome to the Tipton County Museum Online Academy. Today's lecture is part of our Enhancing Classroom Education program. I'm Barrie Foster. I'm the director here at the Tipton County Museum. I'm also an artist and an art teacher. And we have a lot of interesting, fun videos here at the Tipton County Museum. And you can access those by going onto our website, clicking on our Online Academy button. And our website is www.tiptoncountymuseum.com. We also have nature videos, art history videos, genealogy videos, and history videos. So please check those out often. Today's presentation is Lorenzo de Medici, Il Magnifico. Lorenzo was an Italian statesman, a ruler of the Florentine Republic, and a patron of the Renaissance culture. He was born in Florence. Back then, Florence was in Italy, but Italy wasn't a unified country like it is today. So it was the Republic of Florence. He was born on January 1st, 1449. He was one of 5 children. His father was Piero, and he was an art patron and collector. And his mother was Lucrezia Tornabuoni, who was a writer of sonnets, and a sonnet is a type of poem. And she was a friend to poets and philosophers. And if you look at the map, you can see that it's a republic. There are all little Italian republic states there. Lorenzo came from an interesting family legacy. They started out as wool merchants during the Middle Ages, and they had beautiful, fine wool back then, and actually today, Italy is the premier wool maker in the world even today. His great-grandfather was Giovanni, and he started the Medici Bank, and he was a leader of the Merchants Association. Then his grandfather, Cosimo, was a leader of Florence in the year 1434. And you see these pictures here. Lorenzo is in the top row, the 4th one with the red covering, the 4th one from the left. The medieval period is also called the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages, and that was when his great-great-grandfather was a wool merchant. That period lasted from about 500 to 1500 AD. Artwork had religious themes, and there was a reason for that. Back then, the church had all the money. And what they wanted to do was they wanted to glorify God like they do today, but the churches paid to have the artists paint paintings back then. And so they had most of the artwork religious themed, like this painting here of the Virgin Mary with the baby Jesus. Most people during the Middle Ages were poor. They could not read or write. And we have a very special educational program the Tipton County Museum does on Hildegard of Bingen, who was born in 1098. So be sure to check that out on our online academy. Now, the Renaissance period followed the medieval period. Renaissance means rebirth or coming out of the dark. They believed life should be enjoyable. There was secular art and education during that time period, and the word secular means non-religious. So during this time period, artists got to paint a lot of paintings that weren't necessarily religious scenes, a lot of landscapes, townships, things like that. And the people were becoming educated. We have 2 other educational programs that occur during this time period. Please look for those. One is on Leonardo da Vinci, and the other one is on Galileo Galilei. Lorenzo had a wonderful education. Back then, they didn't have schools like they do today, and so he was tutored mostly at home. He was tutored by Gentile de Becchi, who was a diplomat and a bishop. And here's his picture up on the screen. He was one of the premier educators in Florence during that time. He was also tutored by Marsilio Ficino, who was a philosopher. And then Lorenzo also learned the Greek language. That time, the Italian language was a little bit different than it is today. There were a lot of different dialects throughout the Italian republics, but it's very much a Latin-based language. So in addition to speaking his native tongue of Italian, he also learned Greek. Lorenzo was an Italian statesman. He was well known and well loved throughout the land. He was called Lorenzo the Magnificent. That's the title of this. Il Magnifico is Italian for the Magnificent. He was the most promising of his 5 brothers and sisters, and his father sent him on many diplomatic missions when he was still in his youth. He became ruler of the Florentine Republic at the age 30 upon the death of his father. The assets of the Medici Bank declined during Lorenzo's lifetime. So what does that mean? The assets of a bank generally are the money that people have holding in the bank. So the amount of money they had in the bank declined over time. But there were rival families. What happened was a lot of other families got into the banking business, and they didn't have banking rules like we have today. And the rival families, they resented the Medici family. His brother Giuliano was very close to Lorenzo. They were very, very close, and they ruled Florence together. Giuliano was handsome, and he was used as a model by the famous artist Botticelli in his painting Mars and Venus. And here's a painting of Giuliano here. You can see he looks kind of handsome. Lorenzo, on the other hand, was not quite as good looking. Here's a quote that I found was very interesting. Lorenzo was plain of appearance and of average height, having a broad frame and short legs, dark hair and eyes, a squashed nose, short-sighted eyes, and a harsh voice. And if you see this painting of him, it's not a very flattering painting, and I chose that on purpose because you really kind of see he's not that handsome. But you know what? He didn't let that stop him. As a matter of fact, everyone loved him. The Pazzi Conspiracy. The Pazzis were another banking family, and they really resented the Medicis. So on Easter Sunday, on April 26, in 1478, Lorenzo and his brother were attacked at the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore during the Easter worship service. Giuliano was killed. Lorenzo escaped with a minor wound. And you can see in this painting here the attack that's occurring on Easter Sunday. And I found it interesting to note that the Pope had approved the attack. Now the Pope is always the ruler of the church. And back then, this was the Catholic Church. And the Pope didn't like the fact that the Medicis were ruling Florence because the Pope wanted to maintain the power. As a matter of fact, the Pope went after the Medici Bank and they seized all the assets. And actually they seized all of the Medici assets. So they took more than just their money, but all of their things of value. But it backfired because the Pazzi attack was unpopular with the citizens. And so the people rebelled and they rioted. Lorenzo secured constitutional changes in the government there, and he was able to restore peace to the area. And I liked this painting of him because he looks like a statesman there. He looks like a very nice man, a very nice ruler. Lorenzo was a patron of the Renaissance culture. He created the Medici Library, and he distributed lots of books to its citizens. Back then, they didn't have the printing presses like we have today, so he hired men to go out to other countries and purchase books. And he brought them back. The men brought them back to Lorenzo, and he set up a room where they were able to hand copy all of these books. And remember, as part of his education, he studied philosophy. So a lot of these were philosophy books from the early Roman philosophers, books like that. So he had his men copy these books. He also distributed a lot of these books to everyday citizens so they could become educated. Lorenzo commissioned artwork himself. He purchased a lot of artwork, and most of those pieces are in the Medici Manor still today, and you can still see them. A lot of the pieces went to the museums in Italy. But the paintings that he couldn't afford to buy, what he did is he arranged for his friends to buy other artwork as well. So there was a lot of painting going on at that time. It was called the Golden Age of artwork, and it was all happening in Florence, and we have Lorenzo to thank for this. Lorenzo even wrote poetry himself. And in this painting, you can see he's there with other people, and he's there with a sculptor. Some of the artists he supported, we've heard of today. The first one is Leonardo da Vinci, Andrea del Verrocchio, Sandro Botticelli, and Michelangelo Buonarroti, who lived with him and his family for 3 years. And this picture here is a self-portrait that Michelangelo did. The Laurentian Library. The Laurentian Library is actually the Medici's library. You can visit it today. It contains more than 11,000 manuscripts and 4,500 early books. It is considered the private library of the Medici family, but you can get in to see it if you have an appointment. And what I thought was interesting was the building was actually designed by Michelangelo. Michelangelo was an artist, he was a sculptor, he was an architect, and such a good friend to the Medicis. Lorenzo was married to Clarice Orsini, a noblewoman from Rome. They had 10 children of their own. And after the death of his brother Giuliano, he adopted his nephew Giulio. The monk Savonarola, he was an interesting man. Lorenzo had invited the monk to Florence at the urging or the suggestion of one of his other friends. And he said, I've heard of this monk Savonarola. He's a great preacher. I think we could use him here in Florence. And Lorenzo was a very nice man. And he said, okay, let's invite him out. So he came to town, and soon after, he started denouncing secular art and music. And what that means is he was speaking out against it. And this was kind of surprising to Lorenzo because Lorenzo had invited him out, but he was going against everything that Lorenzo was promoting. Savonarola was preaching repentance and reform, and this was in the 1400s, late 1400s, and Savonarola was saying, if you don't repent now, Jesus is going to come back. It's going to be the end of the world. It's going to happen in our lifetime. He claimed to have communicated with the Virgin Mary in heaven, and Martin Luther was influenced by his writings. Now, Martin Luther was the founder of the Lutheran religion, and he was the founder of, or the creator, I guess, of the Reformation of the Catholic Church. But what happened later on to Savonarola was he was tried for heresy, and he was found guilty. And what that means is that they found that he had lied about being a prophet. So he was actually put to death a couple years after Lorenzo passed. But he was a very important figure in the time period, and he was very closely related to Lorenzo. Lorenzo died on April 8th, 1492, and in this picture it's showing his death mask. And for important people of that time period, they did that a lot. They had death masks for those people. So he actually died because he got gangrene in his leg. What happened was it was a genetic condition that he was born with, and somehow he had gotten gangrene in his leg, so he knew he was going to die. He died at the age of 43. But Michelangelo and Savonarola were with him when he died. He is buried with his brother Giuliano in the church of San Lorenzo in Florence, and I've been there and I've seen his tomb. His successor was his eldest son, Piero. Now here's a picture of Piero, and I thought it was interesting because he's got all that hair, he's got a little cap on, and he was known as Piero the Unfortunate. Apparently he wasn't very lucky, nor was he very intelligent, because within 2 years after Lorenzo dying, he had squandered the family assets and he had brought down the Medici dynasty in Florence. And so what does that mean? He spent all the money. There are 2 popes associated with Lorenzo's sons. 2 of his sons became popes. Actually, several Medicis became popes, but 2 are directly related to Lorenzo. Giovanni, who was his second son, he became Pope Leo X around 1512, and he served as Pope until 1521. And then his nephew Giulio, who he adopted, he reigned as Pope Clement VII, and this painting is of him. And he was Pope from 1523 through his death in 1534. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you at the Tipton County Museum.